Welcome to this special edition of Faith and Politics, where we will explore the rich tapestry of holidays and celebrations in three of the world's major religions: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. You know, in a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected, it is more important than ever to foster mutual respect and deepen our understanding of different faiths, and by doing so, we can bridge the gaps that generally divide us. Through our discussions today, we hope to foster a deeper appreciation of the diversity that exists within our global community, and we also hope to foster a greater appreciation for religious freedom. I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. We'd like to welcome to the show Rabbi Craig Axler, who's the lead rabbi of the Temple Isaiah in Fulton, Maryland. We're delighted to have with us as well Asma Uddin, who is a professor, attorney specializing in religious liberty, and the author of the book, When Islam is Not a Religion. Also with us is Pastor Alex Barrientos, who serves as the senior pastor of the Sligo Seventh-day Adventist Church in Tacoma Park, Maryland. And finally, we'd like to welcome Dr. Nelu Berchea, who is the United Nations liaison for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great having you here with us, and we look forward to our discussion that we're going to have today. You know, one of the things that I wanted to really kind of get us to do is to really start to talk a little bit about festivals and activities and things that happen in different, denominations around the world. There's so many of us that don't understand exactly why we have a low level of tolerance, we have a low level of understanding, but we're hoping that today this will be an opportunity for us to help the world to have a better understanding of what goes on in these particular denominations. Rabbi Axel, I want to start off with you first. Talking a little bit of some of the things that you have seen from a celebration standpoint, from things that you do as the lead rabbi and different festivities and holidays that exist from a Judaism standpoint. Could you give us a little bit of that and help us to get started with this conversation?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. And I totally agree that understanding somebody else's faith is really kind of one of the keys to creating more peace and understanding in the world. From a Jewish standpoint, our calendar of festivals is based on what we would call a corrected lunar calendar. It's a lunar calendar that still maintains all of the festivals in the appropriate seasons. Most of our holidays are going to be biblically based. They're going to come from the Torah. They're defined really within the flow of the Torah, and they oftentimes will combine sort of a notion of historical biblical event and some kind of an agricultural aspect to them, which is in part why the Jewish festivals always tend to be, or have to be really, in their correct agricultural season. But really they flow from something like Hanukkah, which is actually a really truly minor festival from a religious standpoint, but takes on greater significance here in America, to a festival that's actually coming up just this week, Shavuot, which is, biblically speaking, really one of the most important festivals of them all, really commemorating the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai 50 days after the exodus from Egyptian slavery. So really, a full flow of holidays over the course of the lunar year. And then there are modern festivals and holidays as well. I'd be happy to talk about those too.
Asma, I'd love to get an idea from your perspective when we think about a lot of the activities that happen in Islam. We know there are tons of celebrations, and some that maybe are recognized here in the United States and in other parts of the world, but some that may be a little bit more unique. Would you mind just giving us a little bit of a flavor and a color of what some of those activities may be?
To some extent, Orlin, I think most of Islam and Muslim practice tends to be shrouded in sort of just a general lack of knowledge or mystery in the U.S. And so similar to what Rabbi Axler said about Judaism, there's a range of different types of holidays and days of commemoration, days of what we call sort of subrogatory fasting, so like not required, but really good for you to do. Some, depending on the sect, you might or might not, or depending on your interpretation of Islam, you might celebrate the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, or some would say not to. And so some of those things are sort of variant depending on sort of what version of Islam you practice. But I think the ones that are uniform across everyone in the faith, and that I think might be somewhat more familiar to the average American, are the two Eid festivals. Eid, meaning E-I-D, is how that is spelled in English. And the one that's actually supposed to be the lesser Eid, as it's called, the other one being the greater Eid, is the one that actually feels often more celebratory because it comes at the conclusion of 30 days of fasting during the month of Ramadan. And so during the month of Ramadan, the Islamic calendar is lunar, so it shifts up 10 days every year. So this past year, Ramadan ended just a few weeks ago towards the end of April, and that'll shift up 10 days next year. And so we fast from dawn till dusk. And so it takes a lot of work to get to our celebration because we have to do that for 30 days. And then at the end, we have multiple days of feasting, essentially, and that is called Eid al-Fitr. And the second Eid, which is referred technically as the greater Eid, is the one that comes at the conclusion of the Hajj pilgrimage, which takes place in Saudi Arabia, but Muslims across the world will celebrate the holiday that comes after that. And that one is called the feast. Eid al-Adha actually stands for Feast of Sacrifice. And it stands for when the Prophet Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son. In the Muslim telling, it's his son Ishmael that he was asked to sacrifice. And at the final moment before the sacrifice happened, Ishmael turned into a lamb and he sacrificed a lamb instead. Oh, I shouldn't say turned into, but was replaced by a lamb. And so it's a story that I think would probably familiar to many of your listeners. Who might be surprised that story is shared in the Muslim religion as well, although I think the sons are switched out. We believe it's Ishmael, whereas I believe most Christians believe that it was Isaac.
Pastor Barrientos, representing Christianity, and you're the pastor of a very large church in the Washington metropolitan area. What are some of the celebrations that you find yourself engaged in, and something that, many of us may talk about, in grand scale, sometimes Christmas, sometimes Lent, sometimes Easter? What are just some of those celebrations? Give us a little bit of flavor on that.
Thank you for having us. And I hope that part of the highlight will be the two major ones that I think will be popularly known. First one being Advent and Christmas, of course, as it commemorates the movement of Christ, or at least the preparation to do so. Advent, meaning from its Latin term, really is adventus, the coming, right? And so the celebration really is about seeing the movement of the Christ and its interaction, of course, with human beings. And so Advent is a preparation for that Christmas time, that birthing, we could say, of the type. And of course, the most popular ones comes out in the spring. Of course, you have the preparation, of course, for Easter. Obviously, Palm Sunday occurs in that although this past year we have seen that Easter was a lot earlier than usual. And of course, we have Palm Sunday, the belief that Jesus rides into Jerusalem on the donkey, of course, announcing kingship, we could say. And as it moves into the week, rounds about Maundy Thursday, which is, of course, the Last Supper commemoration, as it prepares really for that betrayal and how the crucifixion will occur on Good Friday. The idea is then that Holy Saturday takes place on a Sabbath, where perhaps the silence of the Christ occurs. And therefore, although the death has occurred, there is a sense of wandering, of lament of what has occurred. And of course, the most popular, which Paul the Apostle would highlight later on, would say that, of course, because of the resurrection, everything makes sense, we could say. So obviously, Resurrection Sunday is a big deal for believers, primarily because it pivots the sense that faith has now taken an anchor on the Christ itself. So these two major movements has to do more with the movement of the Christ towards God's people.
Powerful. Nelu, can you tell us a little bit about some of the activities maybe in the Eastern Orthodox community? As a matter of fact, as someone who is a representative to the United Nations, I imagine that you find yourself interconnecting with a number of different religious groups and finding out that there may be some festivities you knew of even growing up, and even some new ones you may have found out from, even later on in life. What's been your experience with this?
Eastern Europe is a region characterized by a diversity of religious traditions. So you may find religious festivities and celebration that have profound meanings and purpose in the life of believers. This part of Europe is known to be home of Orthodox Christianity. Most of the people who I'm talking with know about Orthodox Christianity, but it's a little bit more than this. Several Catholics and Muslim countries, and also It's the home of a variety of religious minorities. The Jewish community has a notable presence, and also Protestant communities that include Calvinists, Lutherans, Baptists, Adventists, Pentecostal, and more. These diverse religious groups add to the cultural and religious landscape of Eastern Europe, fostering a vibrant and pluralistic society in this region. We can observe in Eastern Europe a multitude of celebrations and festivals representing the tradition of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Among these, I would like to refer to Christian celebrations and festivals that hold significant influence, playing a central role in public and cultural life. In Eastern Europe, Christmas and Easter celebrations take on unique traditions, reflecting the differences not only between Catholics and Orthodox Christians, but also among the various Orthodox churches belonging to different countries. While Protestant communities may not directly participate in Catholic or Orthodox Christians' festivities, they are often engaged in meaningful discussions surrounding the topics of these religious festivals. They seek to explore the profound and relevant meanings these events hold for believers' spiritual lives.
You know, that's a really good summation there, Lou. And when you think about all the different religions that have been connected in certain parts of the world that have found ways to what I would call peacefully coexist, it makes you wonder, what can we be doing differently here? You know, Asma, you have a great book that you wrote talking about when Islam is not religion. And I think that's the type of information that sometimes makes people wonder a little bit more. What are some of the unique characteristics about being Islam that maybe most individuals are not aware of? Even the story you just told regarding, Abraham and his son, I would imagine that's not a story that most people understand from a celebration from that perspective. Could you give us a little bit of flavor on that piece?
Sure. And Orlin, when I chose to title the book "When Islam is Not a Religion," it was meant to pique interest. What's this all about? One of the great sort of ancient religions of the world being not a religion. And in fact, unfortunately, what I trace in the book is our claims that show up in various forms, but ultimately get at the same idea that somehow Islam is not either a religion or the right type of religion or the type of religion that deserves protection under the U.S. Constitution and our various other legal means of protecting religious liberty. And so I sort of trace that phenomenon, explain why it's deeply problematic for anyone to be trying to claim that a major religion or something that all of us can kind of accept as a religion is something that's not, for the sake of depriving people of their rights. But I think, in the course of sort of navigating that argument, on behalf for the reader and sort of explaining why people say this and, what motivates them and so on, like a huge part of it is just a deep sort of misunderstanding and often fear of Islam and Muslims. And this idea that Islam is just something fundamentally very different from anything that Americans can even begin to understand, when in fact there are so many similarities. Certainly, I was raised as an American Muslim, born and raised in the United States, sort of essentially being told and sort of emphasized just what the similarities were between Islam and specifically Christianity and Judaism. A huge part of the Quran is about the people of the book, right? People of the book being Christians and Jews. And so many of the same stories, the same prophets are the ones that show up in the Bible. And so just necessarily because Islam was revealed after sort of the Quran was revealed in succession, after Judaism and Christianity, but also accepting many parts of those religions, it's sort of like built into my faith to understand that we're all interconnected. And so that was something that I kind of took for granted. And then increasingly kind of being in the space of advocating for religious liberty and seeing all the political fights and misunderstandings, I'm like, wow, it occurred to me very clearly that many Americans are not knowledgeable about the fact that there are these similarities. We hear often about Judeo-Christians or Judeo-Christianity, but you always see sort of Islam separated out from that, created as distinct, often conflict with that, when in fact I think the reality is very different.
Wow, Craig, I got to ask you, when all of the activities from Judaism, whether it's Orthodox, whether it's all of the different sects that exist, how does, as a group, do you end up putting these holidays in place in a way that kind of cuts across all sectors? I mean, how do you see the interactions that take place? And I was interested that you mentioned one of the holidays that maybe from an American standpoint, we think is a huge Jewish holiday, turns out not to be as huge among the Jewish community.
Sure, and that interesting piece about Hanukkah, it has no direct biblical meaning from a Jewish standpoint, in the sense that it's not a part of our sacred scripture, of what we would call the Hebrew scriptures, or what is sometimes referred to as Old Testament. The books of Maccabees, we actually have to thank other religious traditions for maintaining them and kind of giving us the story of Maccabees, and emphasizing, maybe even in a way that the rabbis of the Talmud didn't want to fully emphasize, the historical aspect of the Maccabees. But the idea that holidays morph and change over time, and they're observed by different sects within Judaism, as within all religions, in sometimes radically different ways. One of the things that Asma said that I really resonate with is this idea of Judaism, like Islam, being yes, a religion, and also a peoplehood, also about kind of belonging to something that is larger than what differentiates the ways in which denominations might practice. So within Reform Judaism, and I'm a Reform rabbi, I might practice the holiday that's about to come up, Shavuot, in a radically different way than an ultra-Orthodox or an Orthodox rabbi would, or somebody who practices as a conservative or Reconstructionist Jew, or somebody who says that they're Jewish but secular, which is kind of one of these interesting things to be able to understand in the American context, particularly the idea that one could be Jewish and secular, or even Jewish and humanistic, and the idea that perhaps the holidays aren't actually necessarily the primary thing that is linking people together, or the observance, or the ways in which one observes the holidays. So there are always going to be elements that connect my observance of a holiday to other religious Jews, but the ways in which we celebrate may be incredibly diverse, while recognizing an essential connection to one another as part of one Jewish people. It's a little bit difficult to understand, particularly for people who look at religion as purely about belief or faith.
Alex, I got to ask you, when you think about many of the different things that go on in the area of Christianity, and you start pulling in all the different religious groups that may be involved from a denominational standpoint, there always seems to be something that almost seems to connect the dots for everyone. But we don't always seem to focus on that. We spend a lot of time focusing on those things that don't feel like the connective tissue. When you think about Christianity and some of the other major denominations and activities that happen on a worldwide basis, what are some of the similarities that you see, and how do you connect the dots in terms of being able to say, I've got to look out for my fellow man, even if they may be outside of my quote unquote, denominational purview?
Absolutely. And it's actually a fairly good routing of recognizing that festivals and heritage or traditions aren't necessarily preserving community groups for self-preservation. Actually, it's a harboring of memory of particular events, as mentioned, as well as lineages of thought, which is perhaps even the blessing of the prophets that kind of unites this sort of conversation that we're having. And then obviously how memory plays out into the very actions we choose to value. So for instance, one of those has to do with prayer. One of those has to do with binding together, lamenting together. Whenever there's death in the family, whenever there's death in the community, there's death in the neighborhood, people come together to pray. And it isn't just because we're human beings. It's just the fact that the very practice of a movement of sort binds us, because there's something that's integrated into who we are, but also kind of allowing us to mirror the very actions that have been done before us, regardless of where our practices have come from. And so we start realizing that if we are forming part of neighborhoods or communities that value the similar modalities, we could say, and memories and heartaches, these festivals as well as celebrations bind the larger human person primarily because it models what God is after. And so part of that is really human dignity, and at the core of it, how it truly allows us a true brotherhood, a true sisterhood.
You know, Nelu, this probably resonates with you even a little bit more when you think about in this country, generally every January, we celebrate National Religious Freedom Day. But, you know, as someone who's obviously there at the United Nations on a regular basis and seeing many of these different denominations and thought processes, I would imagine that religious freedom and the ability to serve your God the way you see fit must be a conversation that has to be a rallying cry for all people of faith.
I saw that celebrations and festivals provide opportunities for members of religious organizations to come together as a community. And these events foster a sense of belonging and solidarity among believers, promoting social cohesion and collective identity. I saw in recent years that the United Nations has played a role in influencing religious organizations worldwide by promoting dialogue and respect among different faiths and religions, recognizing the significance of religious organizations as influential actors in addressing global challenges. So through this channel, the United Nations is trying to prioritize the role of faith-based organization in supporting peace and human rights. Of course, to understand better the United Nations, how the United Nations operates and so on, we need to understand that the three pillars that the United Nations has been founded are the following. The first pillar focuses on peace and security. The second is on development and justice. And the third focuses on human rights. And it's also divided into three dimensions: freedom, equality, and human dignity. It is widely recognized that without fairness, peace and security cannot be sustained, as competition for resources may lead to conflicts everywhere in the world. So when I'm looking back to see the contribution in the next 10, 15, 20 years, I saw that the church extended its influence in areas such as education, healthcare, humanitarian efforts, and human rights advocacy. This is just an example by emphasizing the values we are believing in, and our work in participating in the UN's pillars for peace, security, and justice, and mostly religious freedom. Through these channels, we may contribute significantly to the global conversation.
You know, I want to just go around and kind of wrap up with this question for all of you. And I'm going to start with you, Alex. When you start thinking about the work that, from a denominational standpoint, we can do as it relates to charity and social justice and see how that intertwines with our faith traditions, how would you suggest, or how would you point out ways in which, you know, from a Christian denominational standpoint, that's something that we can do and hopefully be impactful?
Everything Christ was about the people. And part of this isn't new per se, because of course his profile seems from the lineage of the prophets. And because the prophets were among the people, sharing messages that would create possibilities for communities to come together in a way that they would adhere to life as we best have it, I think one of the things that we could take from that as a whole is that we are able, in whatever situation, neighborhood, communities that we belong to fight for things that would align themselves to have proper life in its abundance, meaning better possibilities of creating communities of good listening. It's important because the prophets one of the main things they'd like to get across is for people to actually listen, which so we could be conduits to that too. But then also, I think the second thing too, obviously, the fact that prophets were looking for what is just, and that is to say, to make sure that humans actually have the dignity that God has bestowed upon them. I hope we're able to lift that up by being involved in neighborhoods, being engaged in communities that are different from us. So I hope we can do that in a way that's impactful.
You know, Asma, I want to ask you a similar question. You know, if you look at it from an Islam or Muslim perspective, the idea of charity and social justice and being wrapped into your faith traditions in some way, how do you see that coming together in some fashion?
Well, I mean, charity is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. So we are obligated by our faith to donate 2% of our assets, required, and then also encouraged to give all kinds of charity in addition to that. There's so many of our traditions that are built into, they're sort of like intrinsically about generosity to the poor, to the needy. The Prophet Muhammad, like all the prophets who came before him, were very much about serving those most in need, the downtrodden in society. So that sort of same ethos is definitely, permeates our understanding of our religion today. And certainly with lots of sort of the rise of social justice rhetoric in our society and greater sort of increased consciousness of sort of like the inherent complexities of social justice and the ways that we can all hold ourselves accountable, you see a lot of American Muslims really sort of embracing that sort of way of thinking and sort of like understanding the obvious alignments with our religious beliefs.
You know, Craig, I'm going to let you have the last word on this, but from a Judaism standpoint, when you think about charity, you think about impact in your community in line with many of your festivals and celebrations, how do you see those two working together?
For me, it's part of the reason why learning about other people's faiths and helping other people learn about my Jewish faith is so incredibly important. This idea that when we learn about somebody else's faith, when we learn what's our common values, and even what are the things that are distinctive between our faiths, the things where we don't overlap, and then we take those common values and we pursue justice together, and we work to lift up the downtrodden, and we take those values that all of our common prophets were really truly committed to, more so than any of the things that perhaps might divide us from one another. We're really truly going to understand one another better. And I'm very convinced that when you understand somebody better, it makes it very, very difficult to dislike or even to hate them. And as a good friend of mine that I met through interfaith work and activity would say, it makes it actually really much easier to love them.
You know, I have to tell you that one of the best parts of the year for me is when I get a chance to engage in interfaith activities, and you get a chance to really focus on the fact that as a foundation of everything that we should be, it should be on a foundation of love. You know, one of my favorite statements is I like to tell people that love is the fruit that's always in season. There's never a bad time to engage in love. And I think one of the things that we found out through this dialogue is there's so many things that actually connect us, a lot more than divide us. But if we can figure out how to allow the power of love to really be interspersed in everything that we do from a denominational standpoint or from a religious standpoint, I think we're all going to be a much better community. You know, I got to thank you guys for being part of this conversation today. This is not the type of thing that normally you sit around and probably do on a regular basis, but every now and then just making sure that people understand better what goes on from a denominational or religious standpoint, I think is critical. So thank you very much. And thank you for being here with us today. And remember, if you want to join us as it relates to God and government, come with us because it's going to be Faith and Politics. See you next time.